Okay, so you sent over this article about getting the C-suite to buy into IP strategy. It
Hmm.
sounds like you're about to walk into some pretty tough conversations.
Yeah.
The article is How to Sell Your IP Strategy to the C-Suite by Dr. Ari Masudi.
Okay.
He calls himself Firework PhD.
Wow.
I mean, that's some serious confidence, right? Gotta know what he's got.
Well, confidence is definitely important when you're trying to sell a new idea, especially something as complex as IP strategy can be. But this article actually lays out a pretty systematic approach to handling all the pushback you're likely to get.
Yeah, he actually lists 24 different objections you might run into, and then he groups them all into three main categories.
Right, and understanding those categories is crucial because it helps you figure out what the root cause of the resistance is. The first one is basically just straight up denial. Like, executives might say, we've always done it this way, or it's too expensive, essentially just burying their heads in the sand.
So that's where that cautionary tale of Kodak, a company that was so dominant so long, but then got completely blindsided by the whole digital revolution. And it makes you wonder, like, has your industry seen similar disruptions? Disruptions that might mean you need to shift your thinking about IP.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get so caught up in the day-to-day that you miss those larger trends that are reshaping everything. But ignoring those trends can be just as dangerous as ignoring a crack in your foundation. Eventually, it's going to lead to bigger problems down the line. Neglecting to adapt your IP strategy can leave you extremely vulnerable.
Now, that second category of objections that Dr. Masudi talks about, that seems to be more about being skeptical of the specific solution that you're proposing. So they get that there's a problem, but they don't like your answer.
Right, and this is where I think Dr. Masudi's emphasis on real-world examples is really smart. He uses examples like Apple, which, believe it or not, they started out pretty small, and they had to prove the value of their IP strategy over time.
Interesting. So instead of just saying, trust me, this will work, you need to be able to show them how it's worked for other companies, even if those companies seem completely different from yours on the surface.
Exactly. It's about building credibility and showing that you've really thought this through, like you've done your homework, and you're drawing parallels to companies that they already respect. Like, it's kind of like instead of just handing them a blueprint, you're showing them a finished building and explaining how you got there.
I like that analogy. Now, I'm curious, is there anything that stood out to you from all of these objections?
You know what I think is fascinating is how Dr. Masudi points out that sometimes you might actually get pushback because your IP strategy is too simple.
Too simple. Isn't simplicity usually a good thing?
It can be, but I think sometimes, especially in the business world, people tend to think that if something is really complex, it must be sophisticated. If it's not convoluted, it can't possibly be good enough. But then you look at a company like Dropbox. They built an empire on an idea that, at least on the surface, seems incredibly simple.
Interesting point. So it sounds like the takeaway here is that simplicity can be a strength, but you need to be able to articulate why it's a strength in your specific case, like how that simplicity actually makes your strategy more effective or more efficient, and ultimately how it helps you achieve the company's goal.
Exactly. And that actually ties into the third category of objections Dr. Masudi talks, which is more about just expressing some reservation and needing more information. It's not a no, but it's not a yes either.
So they're cautiously optimistic, but they're not fully.
Right. It's more like, okay, I'm intrigued, but tell me more.
Yeah.
And for those situations, Dr. Masudi recommends taking a phased approach, kind of like how Amazon tests out new features and products all the time. Start with a smaller pilot program. Dip your toes in the water before you jump in headfirst.
So instead of trying to overhaul the entire system all at once, you pick one specific area where your IP strategy implements, like a smaller scale test.
Right. A proof of concept. And just like Amazon uses all the data from those pilot programs to refine their approach, you can use the data you gather to prove the value of your IP strategy.
So it's not just about mitigating risk. It's about gathering real-world evidence to back up your claims. Did Dr. Masudi give any other examples of companies using that kind of phased approach successfully?
Yeah, he did. And one that really resonated with me was Google's early patent strategy. They were really focused on securing these smaller, almost insignificant wins at first. But over time, all those small wins added up to a really massive and influential portfolio.
So it's almost like that snowball effect, where each small success builds momentum and makes it easier to achieve even bigger things.
Exactly. It's kind of like compound interest for your IP strategy.
I like that. Looking back at all of this, it seems like a lot of these objections, they really just boil down to good old-fashioned fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of rocking the boat.
That's a really good observation. I think at us human nature to resist change, especially when we're talking about something as potentially complex as IP. And what I think is so brilliant about Dr. Masudi's framework is that he gives you these really concrete strategies for addressing those fears head on and turning that skepticism into support.
So it's about acknowledging those fears, not just dismissing them, and then offering some tangible solutions and evidence to try and alleviate their anxieties.
Exactly. For example, when you're trying to address those fears about complex and how hard it's going to be to implement everything, Dr. Masudi talks about how important clear communication and training are. He gives the example of IBM, they have these internal IP awareness initiatives. And those initiatives help their entire team understand the strategy and ultimately champion it.
So it's not enough to just have a great strategy. You need to make sure everyone understands and they feel comfortable with it and they know how to execute on it.
Right. It's like having this amazing state-of-the-art race car.
Mhm.
But forgetting to train the pit crew. You need everybody to be on the same page, working together to achieve success.
That's a great analogy. All of this pure gold. But before we go too far, I want to circle back to something Dr. Masudi said about being proactive with IP management. He talked about ARM Holdings. They're a big player in the mobile tech space, and they really gained a competitive edge by building this strong IP portfolio early on.
Right. And I think what's really crucial here is this concept of anticipating what's coming next. ARM Holdings didn't just react to the mobile revolution, they were prepared for it.
So instead of playing catch-up, they were already in a position to take advantage of all these new trends. They weren't just protecting themselves, they were strategically setting themselves up for success.
Exactly. It's about having that proactive mindset, recognizing that IP isn't just a shield to defend yourself. It can also be a sword to help you conquer new markets and achieve those big, ambitious goals.
I love that. Now, I think this brings up a question that a lot of our listeners might be having right now. How do you actually achieve that level of proactive, strategic IP management, especially when resources are limited?
That's where things get really interesting because Dr. Masudi doesn't shy away from that reality. The reality that a lot of companies have limited budgets. In fact, he gives some really inspiring examples of companies that did amazing things with very few resources, like SpaceX in its early days.
SpaceX, on a shoestring budget, I'm all ears. How did they manage that?
Well, it was a combination of being incredibly resourceful and really laser-focused prioritization. They had to get creative, leverage every single resource they had to the absolute max, and they had to make some really tough choices about which IP assets were truly essential to their mission.
So instead of letting those limitations hold them back, they actually use them as fuel for innovation.
Right. It's about working smarter, not necessarily harder.
And I think that approach applies even if you're not building rockets. Like, think about your own company. What are some things that you're doing that might seem insignificant right now, but could actually be turned into valuable IP assets with a little bit of ingenuity and strategic thinking?
Exactly.
Okay, you're blowing my mind here. Dr. Masudi clearly knows what he's talking about. He's not just giving us some abstract theory. He's offering real actionable insights backed by some really impressive success. And speaking of success stories, he also talked about how Philips, they're known for their electronics and healthcare technology. They actually improve their overall efficiency through strategic IP management.
Yeah, that's a classic example of how IP, when it's done right, can actually help streamline your operations and make you more competitive. It's not just about those defensive patents. It's about using IP to make smarter choices about which projects to focus on, how to allocate resources more effectively, and how to avoid duplicating your efforts.
So it's like decluttering your entire innovation pipeline. IP becomes this tool that helps you zero in on what really matters and streamlines your path to success.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, and I don't want to overwhelm our listeners, but there's one more point from Dr. Masudi's article that I think is really important, especially for anyone who's feeling like they're fighting an uphill battle to get their company to take IP seriously. He talks about Steve Jobs, the iconic visionary behind Apple, and how even HE faced internal resistance when he was pushing to patent the iPhone's design.
You know, that's such a good point. It's a powerful reminder that even the most revolutionary ideas, they often face a lot of pushback, even from the people within your own company. What's so inspiring about Jobs is that he didn't back down. He had this unwavering belief in his vision.
So even if you're running into those "this will never work here" objections, you can't give up. You have to stand your ground and make that compelling case for why this strategy is so important.
Exactly. Sometimes the most groundbreaking ideas, they start with a single person who just refuses to give up on their vision.
So to all our listeners out there, if you're feeling like you're the lone voice in the wilderness, just remember Steve Jobs and that iPhone. It takes courage to stand by your convictions, especially when you're facing resistance.
Absolutely. And it's also a reminder that building a strong IP strategy, it's not something that happens overnight. Dr. Masudi talks about Netflix and how they built their IP infrastructure over time alongside their core business growth.
Right. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
You're not going to see those massive returns right away, but you have to be patient and keep making those smart moves, keep securing those wins, and eventually you'll have built a solid foundation for long-term success.
I think that's a great place to wrap up part one. We've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to unpack.
Definitely. In the next part, I think we should delve into some of those real-world IP success stories in more and really try to pull out those key takeaways that our listeners can apply to their own situation.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So to everyone listening, make sure you tune in for part 2 of our deep dive. We'll be back soon with even more insights and actionable advice. See you then.
See you then. Well Welcome back. I'm excited to dig into some of the actual success stories that Dr. Masudi talks about in the article.
Me too. It's one thing to talk about the theory, but I think actually seeing these principles in action is what's really going to help our listeners connect the dots and see how this all applies to their own companies.
Right.
So which success story are you most excited about?
Well, one that really stands out to me is IBM. They've been around forever, and their approach to IP has really evolved over time. Like they went from focusing on mainly hardware patents to software and services, which just shows how adaptable they are.
It's like they're constantly reinventing themselves to stay ahead of the curve. But how does that apply to our listeners? Most of them probably don't work at companies the size of IBM.
I think the big takeaway here is that your IP strategy can't be static. It has to be dynamic and responsive to the market, just like IBM has been. So think about what technologies or innovations are really driving your industry right now. Those are the areas where your IP strategy should be focused.
So it's not just about protecting what you've already created, it's also about anticipating what's coming next and positioning yourself to capitalize on those new trends.
Exactly. And that actually leads to another important point that Dr. Masudi makes about transparency and aligning your IP strategy with the company's value. It can't just be something that's dictated by the legal department or forced on everyone from the top down.
Right, it has to feel authentic, like it's genuinely connected to the company's overall mission. Because if people don't understand why they're doing something, they're probably not going to be very motivated to actually DO it.
Right. It's about getting everyone on the same page and working together towards a common goal. When people see how the IP strategy benefits not just the company as a whole, but also their own individual work and their own contribution, that's when it becomes really powerful.
Okay, so let's go back to that idea of a phased approach. You mentioned Amazon earlier and how they're always testing new things. How does that translate into an actual IP strategy?
Well, I think it's all about finding that balance between thinking big and starting small. You can have this grand vision for how you want IP to transform your company, but it's usually smarter to start with something smaller and more manageable.
So instead of trying to do everything at once, you pick one specific area and run a pilot program.
Right. Almost like a proof of concept. You test things out, gather some data, and then you use that data to refine your approach.
So it's not just about proving that it works, it's also about minimizing risk. Now, you also talked about Google's early patent strategy and how they weren't focused on winning these big splashy lawsuits. They were more about getting those smaller, more strategic wins.
Right. It was almost like they were laying the groundwork for something much bigger.
So those early wins kind of created a positive feedback loop.
Yeah. Each win built momentum.
Yeah.
And made it easier to get buy-in for even bigger initiatives.
It's like you're proving the concept step by step, gaining confidence with each success.
Exactly.
Now, Dr. Masudi also talks about how important it is to differentiate your IP strat from past failure, especially if your company has tried and failed with IP in the past.
Right, because you have to overcome that skepticism that we've tried that and it didn't work mentality. So you have to be able to explain what's different this time and why it's more likely to be successful.
So you're not just presenting a new strategy, you're also addressing the ghosts of IP initiatives past and showing how you've learned from those days. And sometimes that might even involve reframing the entire conversation. Like Dr. Masudi gives this example of executives seeing a contradiction between trying to increase quality and also trying to reduce costs.
Yeah, that's a classic one. It's that whole you can't have your cake and eat it too mentality.
Exactly. But can you actually achieve both of those goals?
Well, think about it this way. A strong patent can give you a competitive edge, which might allow you to charge more for your product. And that increase in revenue could then be reinvested back into R&D, leading to even higher quality products.
So it's not just about protecting your invention. It's about creating this virtuous cycle where IP drives both innovation and profitability.
Exactly.
Okay, now we're talking. Now, I know that anytime you're talking about making a big change, especially something as complex as IP strategy, there are always going to be concerns about potential downside or unforeseen consequence. How does Dr. Masudi address that?
Well, he stresses the importance of building safeguards into your strategy and having regular reviews. It's about acknowledging that there are risks, but also showing that you've thought them through and you have a plan to mitigate.
So it's not about pretending that everything's going to be perfect. It's about being honest and saying, look, we know there are potential downsides, but here's how we're going to address them.
Exactly.
That kind of transparency can go a long way in building trust.
Absolutely. And it also ties into another important point Dr. Masudi made about how crucial clear communication and training are for successful IP implementation. He gives the examples of IBM and Microsoft, both companies with really strong IP cultures.
So it's not enough to just have a strategy. You have to make sure that everyone understands it.
Right.
They know how to actually put it into practice.
Exactly. It's like having a Ferrari, but nobody knows how to drive stick shift.
Right. You need everyone to be on the same page working together.
Yeah. So that might involve doing workshops or online training modules, or even just having regular communication about IP, like sharing success stories or talking about new developments.
It's all about creating that IP-aware culture where
Perfect.
everyone understands the value of IP
Hmm.
and how it contributes to the company's overall success.
Right. And it's an ongoing process. You can't just train people once and then expect them to remember everything. You have to constantly reinforce the message and
Right.
make IP a part of your company's DNA.
Okay, so this has been incredibly valuable, but I'm sure there's at least one listener out there right now who's thinking, well, that's all fine and good, but our company is different. That won't work here. How do you address that kind of pushback, especially when it's coming from senior leadership?
That's another area where I think Dr. Masudi's focus on real-world examples is really helpful.
Yeah.
Because he specifically talks about Qualcomm, a company that's been very successful in adapting its core IP strategy to different markets.
So it's not about blindly copying what other companies have done. It's about understanding the principles behind those strategies
Right.
and then figuring out how to apply them to your specific context.
Exactly. It's like taking a recipe and adjusting the ingredients to your taste.
I like that. So you have to be able to connect the dots and show how, even though the details might be different, the fundamental principles of a good IP strategy are universal.
Right. It's all about protecting your innovations,
Yeah.
leveraging your intellectual assets,
Yeah.
and creating a competitive advantage. And those principles apply whether you're a huge multinational corporation
Yeah.
or a small startup.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the nitty-gritty of IP strategy, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface. In our final part, I think we should really focus on those the things that our listeners can start doing right away to put all of this to act. Okay, welcome back to our IP strategy deep dive. We've talked about those 24 objections, and we've looked at how companies like IBM and Amazon have really made IP a core part of what they do. But even with all this practical advice, I feel like Dr. Masudi is also reminding us that this isn't just about, charts and patents.
Yeah, you know what really strikes me about this article is how Dr. Masudi never loses sight of the human element. Like he's constantly reminding us that this is ultimately about connecting with people, understanding what motivates them and what their concerns are. It's not just about presenting data, it's about telling a story.
It's about making them care, right? Because dry facts and figures, they rarely inspire anyone to actually do anything. But a compelling narrative now, that's what really sticks.
Exactly. And that's why I think those real-world examples are so powerful. When you can actually show people how other companies, maybe even companies that are facing similar challenges to theirs, have succeeded by using a strategic approach to IP, it can really make them see what's possible.
Right. It's that if they can do it, maybe we can too, kind of. It's about planting that seed of inspiration and showing them that this isn't just some abstract theory.
Exactly. It's about giving them a glimpse of a future where their company is thriving because they made the smart decision to invest in IP. And that reminds me of the Steve Jobs example we talked about earlier on the iPhone. Imagine all the pushback he must have gotten internally.
Yeah, that story really highlights how innovation often starts one person, one voice, one person who has this unwavering belief in an idea that maybe nobody else. It takes real courage to stick to your vision, especially when you're facing that kind of
It does. And sometimes the ideas that seem the most radical or even a little bit crazy at first, those are the ones that end up changing the world.
So to our listener out there, if you're feeling like you're banging your head against a wall trying to get people to buy into your IP vision, just remember Steve Jobs and that iPhone. It's about persist, about that deep conviction in what you know.
Absolutely. And it's also a good reminder that building a really strong IP strategy, it doesn't happen overnight. Like Dr. Masudi talks about Netflix and how they very deliberately built up their IP infrastructure over time as their business grew.
So it's a lesson in patience and persistence. IP is a long game. You're not going to see those massive overnight successes, but you have to keep at it, keep making those smart decisions, keep securing those wins, and eventually you'll have built this incredibly solid foundation future.
Exactly. It's like building a house. You start with the foundation, then you frame the walls, and little by little over time, you end up with this really strong structure that can withstand anything. IP is the same way.
That's a great analogy because a solid IP strategy really is like a shelter for all those amazing innovations coming up with. It protects them, it helps them flourish, and it makes your whole business more resilient in the face of competition and all the changes that are constant.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this one thought. Embracing IP is an investment in the future of your company. It's about recognizing that your ideas, your innovations, they have real value, and that value deserves to be protected and leveraged to its full potential.
So to everyone listening, as you get ready for that next IP strategy, remember that bold, paired, and be. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. But with the right mindset and strategic approach, you can turn those IP dreams into reality and set your company up for a filled with innovation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.